Okay, so I'd like to welcome Danielle Celermajer. I first became aware of Danielle when I read her paper, The Fate of the Illegible Animal, that Ruth actually put me onto, which was about the pressures that face the wild Australian Teamster donkey in Australia. And then Danielle and I have been in a few meetings to do with the Australian donkey and ejiao and the pressures that it faces. So yeah, she's a bit of a subject matter expert in feral animals and how they are regarded in Australia. And she very kindly made some time for us today. She's just had a book out that she wrote about the bushfires in Victoria, which is keeping her busy at the moment. So I'd like to introduce Danielle and thank her for making some time to talk to us today.
Thanks, everyone. Very nice to meet you. Actually, was writing about the bushfires on the south coast of New South Wales, which is where I live. No, not a problem at all. But I live in an intentional multi-species community. So as well as working, I'm the Deputy Director of the Sydney Environment Institute. And I work on the interface between human injustice, animal injustice and environmental injustice, or what we call multi-species injustice or justice. But I also happen to live with 7 donkeys who are the delight of my life. So my work in this field both has a personal and a professional dimension. I have a bit of a technical problem in that my printer is not working, and I was hoping to print out just some notes that I would use. So I'm going to have them up on my computer, but I want to share some slides. So hopefully this is going to work. Oh, I think that someone has to make me.
Yeah, Keith. Keith, can you authorize Danielle to be able to share her screen, please?
Otherwise, I could.
If you, I'll go. He might not.
No, you should be able to. You should be able to do it now.
Yep, I can do it now.
Oh, awesome.
Okay, so hopefully is that working okay?
Yeah, beautiful.
It's gone back to, you see, the problem is I need to have my notes there. So I'm sorry, I can't give you the nice full screen because if I do, then I can't see my notes that I want to consult. So hopefully this is going to work, but please bear with me for slight technical problems. So I know that there's a lot of interest in particular in the ejiao issue, which I'm going to touch on at the end. But I actually want to talk more generally about the development of the relationship that Australian governments, and in particular the Western Australian government, have with wild donkeys, or what they like to know as pest donkeys or feral donkeys. So just to give a bit of a history and to try and contextualise this rather disastrous point that we've come to. I'll probably speak for about half an hour, maybe a little bit less, but then hopefully we can have a conversation. So I wanted to start by saying that in the northwest of Australia, the Kimberley region, that I'm sure everybody here knows, there are huge pastoral leases where the primary activity, the primary economic activity is growing cows for export, and also some limited agriculture. There's oil, gas extraction, and nickel and diamond mining. They're the main extractive industries. There are also vast national parks there that are very important to the economy in terms of tourist dollars, but they're also very rich in biodiversity. This is the region where I've done my most research, so that's the place that I'm focusing on. 93.5% of the region is now recognised as native title land, Aboriginal owned land. but there's certainly overlaps with pastoral and mining activity. So from a human perspective, the Kimberley is a very rich patchwork of land use with different types of occupation, and there are special zones that have been created for the preservation of native or animals and plants that are deemed native, which is very much in line with a kind of recognition of the destruction of many economic activities. So that's from the human perspective, and I want to move now to how donkeys fit in with this scheme. So from the donkey perspective, across that patchwork of land, or at least most of it, it's actually not a patchwork. It's pretty much wall to wall the same type of treatment, a treatment of legalized killing. But before I get to that present, which I will in a moment, I just want to move a little bit to the history of donkeys. Sorry, so that's a picture of the Kachana, the place where I have been working in the Kimberley region. So if we go back historically, a little, donkeys were brought to Australia very early on. They were intrinsic to the colonial project. They were imported as unpaid labour. That might seem like a very strange term, that we don't think of animals as being the sorts of beings who could be paid, only humans. But when you recognise how intrinsic donkeys have been to actually the accumulation of wealth in this country, it's a kind of interesting question to pose: who has a right to be paid or their work to be recognised or not? So they provided the material support for settlers to penetrate right into the country, to terraform the land through agriculture and mining, to transport what was grown or extracted for commodity markets, to build colonial wealth. You know, they transported agriculture up and down, they built roads, etc. But of course, in the late 19th century, as mechanisation entered, they became superfluous to the development of the economy, and they were recognised as having no other use value or no other aesthetic value, unlike horses. And so they were released into what people then thought was like this kind of vast country where there was so much of it that it didn't matter, and probably they would die out or something anyway. But of course, we know that donkeys are extraordinarily inventive and resilient, and the very characteristics that made them so suitable for working under harsh conditions were the same characteristics that allowed them to thrive and to survive. And in fact, they built communities and expanded their lives under these very harsh conditions, or conditions that are harsh for many other beings. And that was relatively unproblematic so long as they considered land that the white settlers thought was useless, both from an extractive and an agricultural perspective. But you know, when they were in Aboriginal land, it was not seen as a problem. But as soon as agricultural and extractive interests, or economic interests, and donkeys started to clash, matters started to look very different. So that we can see that most clearly in the change of language. So donkeys were renamed as feral and invasive. Feral meaning that they had crossed over, they were kind of improperly moved from being domestic, where they were useful, to being a threat to economic productivity, and invasive, I'll come back to, meaning that they didn't belong there. They had crossed this border between animals that belong elsewhere in other countries or geographies, and the native animals who belong here. Now, from my point of view, renaming donkeys as feral, as invasive, we can see very clearly legitimates violence against them. So because they're enemies of agriculture, they're enemies of activities that humans undertake for profit, or they're enemies of native animals. Killing doesn't just become something that is desirable, it becomes the right thing to do. So it's the kind of moralizing of killing them. So let's look at what actually happens in Western Australia. So there's a piece of law called the Western Australian Biosecurity and Agricultural Management Act, and that requires that all animals except humans are assigned a legal status. And under an associated, they have this Australian list, and after that list you find two species. One is Equus asinus, in brackets domestic, and one is Equus asinus, in brackets feral. So the former, the domestic one, is classified as legal, and the latter is classified as a declared pest. Of course, everybody knows it's exactly the same animal, just depends how it's living its life. Now, when an animal is a declared pest, under this legislation, it's subject to so-called control requirements, which is a euphemism for killing. So here, so I'm just going to move this. So here you can see the methods for killing, which is, I'm going to come back to this, but it's primarily shooting from helicopters, and as I'll speak about the so-called Judas Method. So in practice, what happens is they're called RBGs, the recognised biosecurity groups, are made up of farmers who believe that donkeys interfere with their economic activities, and they are funded by the government to carry out the eradication activities. If you look at the acronyms that they use and the way that they describe this apparently very technical approach to killing, you get the impression that it's actually founded on very sound research. But if you move past this type of rhetorical facade, it actually turns out that there's very little beyond dogma and their power to kill animals. So there are a bunch of researchers and welfare advocates who have come up with a set of principles for ethical wildlife control, and they include principles like there should be a clear justification for killing, there should be a rationale for how to plan and address the problem, an outcome evaluation, and so on. And according to these principles, neither the animal's categorization, e.g. that it's called a pest, nor weakly defined notions like destructiveness are legitimate justifications. Now, when Ariane Wallach and I, who have done research in the Kimberley, asked for hard data or any proper research underpinning the eradication of programs in the Kimberley or any evaluation that was more than anecdotal, we have been met with silence. Nevertheless, since 1978, the local RBG, recognised biosecurity group, has killed over 590,000 donkeys, a figure that when I mention people find absolutely unbelievable and is just not known in this country. They claim that there are around 1,000. This was actually probably 2.5 years ago that they claimed that, and I think they probably think there are a few more now, but they see they're just these kind of remnant donkeys that are remaining in different patches of the Kimberley. Now, the BAM Act doesn't restrict how animals can be killed. Any restrictions come from the Western Australian Welfare Act, which forbids cruelty to animals, including, quote, torturing or maliciously wounding, tormenting, or otherwise ill-treating animals. The problem is that if you look at that act carefully, under section 21, it lists exemptions, and exemptions include declared pests. So this is one of the great unknowns about animal welfare laws in Australia, that they have these kind of grand statements about the sorts of treatments that are not allowed, but then they have lists of exemptions, and those exemptions generally cover animals used in animal agriculture and also declared pests. So that means that for any animal who is designated a pest as donkeys are in Western Australia. All that's required is that killing takes place in a manner that is, quote, generally accepted as usual and reasonable. There's absolutely no monitoring and there's no specification beyond that. Okay, so what do we know about how donkeys are actually killed in the Kimberley? Not a good story. So some of you might know about this. If you don't, then prepare yourself. The most common method for killing wild donkeys is the so-called Judas Method. It involves capturing a jenny, fitting her with a radio collar, releasing her and allowing her to return to her herd. Shooters in helicopters then track her and they kill the entire herd, leaving her alive to lead them to a new herd, because as we all know, donkeys are incredibly socially connected animals and they're not going to stay by themselves. So she will witness her friends being killed over and over again until she is the only one left and she will be shot. And I think that we should pause and think about this name, the Judas Method. So Judas, as everyone knows, was said to have betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And the Jenny similarly is forced to betray her friends. And I just think, as Ariane and I say in the article from which I'm drawing this talk, who is betraying who is really something that ought to be thought about in slightly more capacious terms. But the cruelty, to this group of people, I don't need to emphasize the cruelty of the method. Shooting donkeys from high-speed helicopters is not an accurate method of killing. So donkeys are often left with injuries out in the desert where they die slow and horrible deaths. And of course, the deepest cruelty of all is to the Jenny herself. And I'm just going to quote from Deborah Bird Rose, the late Deborah Bird Rose, who wrote really beautifully about this. She said, Judas' work poses for her a double bind, either turn away from others in order to show her care for them, or join them and see them die. The Jenny's options are devastating, and like a prism in the sun, her choice continues to show the moral putrefaction of Judas' work. So the other side, so that's the one of the sides of the justification of killing is to protect agricultural activity. But donkeys are also made killable because they're seen to undermine the viability of native and threatened species in conservation areas. So there's a very large property called Mornington Marion Downs in the Kimberley, which belongs to the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. And here killing of donkeys is seen as a major conservation activity. So if you go onto the website of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, you see something which I personally find truly horrific, which is like a counter. It's this kind of little counter that which is ticking over, and it's showing the number of invasive species and pests that are being killed. So the killing of animals like donkeys is seen as this kind of point of pride, supposedly because that's protecting all of the native species, but irrespective, with absolutely no recognition that these other beings are being killed. It's a very charged debate in invasion biology, and Ariane has suffered this more than I have, but I can say that if you write about this and you in any way question the mass killing of species who are deemed pests or invasive, who are said to interfere with native species, you're labelled, you know, I've had people write to me and say, you clearly hate Australian animals, you don't care about extinction. So this is a very, very polarised field. The category of invasive species is understood as the absolute opposite of native species, and it's understood in the literature and in this debate as if there's this really bright line between native species and invasive species. But of course, that line means that we say that Australia is this kind of natural place as opposed to it's a nation. You know, if you looked from the skies, you wouldn't necessarily see the world divided up that way. But more importantly, it assumes that there's a time, because nature's always changing, right? Species are changing. But the line of 1788, when Captain Cook, when the first white guy came and declared that this was going to be part of the British colonies, that's the line that is imposed between invasive and native species, or pest and native species. So any animals who came after 1788, apart from humans, are said to be non-natives, and anyone who was here before is said to be a native. Now, Aboriginal people, there's a diversity of views amongst Aboriginal people, but Aboriginal people don't necessarily accept that. So there's some great research that was done in the 70s. There's really not a lot of research that's been done since then, but where I haven't got the quotes in front of me, but there are some wonderful quotes in that research of Aboriginal people saying they live here, they're from here. So that line, you know, that we would think is one held much more strongly by the Indigenous peoples themselves is actually one that is much more questioned for them than it is for us. Now, the problem with labelling an animal invasive is that it makes it seem like its destructiveness is very simple. You know, native animals are good for each other and for the country, and invasive species are bad. And only the negative impacts are highlighted and then just used to justify the killing. But this is really Ariane's work, not mine. I'm a philosopher and an ethicist. She is an ecologist, but I have learnt from her that actually we have to understand ecological systems as these dynamic systems of moving parts. So, for example, donkeys have beneficial effects, like they contribute to controlling fires because they eat grasses, and through their manure, they fertilise the land. Or some of you may have seen, I think Chase, you probably posted on the Facebook page, Eric's article that was in Science and written up in the conversation last week, showing that in the Sonoran Desert in the United States, donkeys are digging up what he calls assholes to provide water for other species. And there's anecdotal, there's not yet scientific evidence, but there's anecdotal or, kind of observed evidence that they're doing the same in the Kimberley. So they're having beneficial effects. Eric Lundgren, who was a PhD student of Ariane's, has looked at the functionality of species. So rather than looking at the identity of species, what we call them, has looked at what was the ecological niche that donkeys now fulfill. So in the Pleistocene, as many of you would know, there were megafauna in Australia that were made extinct. And he believes that donkeys are the functional equivalents of the mega wombats who were once in this country but are now extinct. So understood that way, rather than seeing them as invasive and therefore bad, we could think of them as actually filling an ecological niche. But you can't see that when all that you see is that they're pests and invasive. So once an animal is labelled invasive, as I said, and seen as destructive to threatened or valuable or desired species like native species, killing them isn't only morally justified, it's morally required. it's like a holy war. And the language, if you read invasive invasion biology, if you read any of the literature, the militaristic language is absolutely all over it. So I just wanted to, this is on the gate of Mornington Downs. Welcome to Mornington Wildlife Sanctuary. The area you are entering has been destocked. Please close the gate. So this notion that, you know, it just, sorry, I've lost my quote that I wanted to read to you guys. So this is a quote from Andreas Glansing, who's the Chief Executive of the Centre for Invasive Species Solutions in Australia. Invasive species don't stop at state borders. It's now an arms race, and we need new and innovative ideas such as biocontrol agents and genetic technologies. So we see invasive species decline and species rise. So that's just an example of the kind of an arms race. That type of language is all over the way in which donkeys get spoken about in this country. And I think most people would be, I was certainly very shocked, and I think most people would be very shocked to learn that the greatest number of species animals killed in this country are actually for conservation. So if you look at that graph, you can see that that's the total species that are targeted for killing, and this is the number that are killed for conservation, which is larger than farming, sport, consumption, commercial, domestic. So we in this country kill a lot of animals in the name of saving other animals, and unfortunately donkeys are on the wrong side of that that divide of who's killable and who ought to be saved. So I just wanted to say a few words at the end about ejiao, because ejiao is not separate from this story. So as some of you will know, because you're in the group discussing this, or you may have read information about it, there's been a massive incursion into many countries, and now we're seeing the possible incursion into Australia with the expansion of the ejiao industry. So this graph here it shows you between 2000 and 2016 the rise in the price. So ejiao is a traditional Chinese medical product, for people who don't know, that is made from the skin of donkeys. So that's the rise in the price. And this is the growth rate in the market. So this is a very, very rapidly expanding market, both in terms of the consumption of the product, but also the pricing of the product. And as the numbers of donkeys in mainland China have been decimated, the Chinese market has expanded first into a number of African countries, also into Brazil, into Nepal, into Pakistan. And there has been talk for some time about moving into Australia. So as a number of African countries have been resisting, because donkeys play an important part in village level economies. And there's also some terrible environmental consequences of the killing of donkeys because of the way in which they're killed and the runoff going into streams and water sources and so on. Donkey welfare itself isn't necessarily the driving source of the resistance, in other words. So in 2018, the Northern Territory government acquired a breeding herd of feral donkeys or wild donkeys for a genetic improvement study at Kidman Springs Research Station, west of Katherine. I don't really know, we don't really know what happened to that, but the way that this was being framed was that it was going to be a real windfall for Territorians, because there would be this new market in exporting a product, but also they would be ridding themselves of this invasive pest that was already seen as, you know, an undesirable being in the Australian landscape. Now, whether there's going to be that type of official market in Australia is really unclear. There are some signs of some little kind of pop-up industries happening in various places, but it's very, at this stage, quite unclear what's happening. So I wanted to just finish on perhaps a less negative note about, you know, some possible alternatives for everyone loves donkeys and can see the role that they can play as companions, as guardians. You know, that's kind of one possible life that donkeys could have with human beings. But a more interesting, perhaps, experiment from the point of view of wild donkeys is the work that Chris Hengler is doing at a station called Kachana in the East Kimberley. So Chris has trained with some schools of regenerative farming that reject the notion that hooved animals are necessarily bad for low rain landscapes, for desert-like landscapes. And their theory, and it's based on a lot of practice, particularly in a number of countries in Africa, is that if hoofed animals are really bad for landscapes when we farm them, when we keep them in the space, so they're constantly on the land. But if they're moving through the land the way that hoofed animals would have before domestication, they actually can be quite good for the land because they reduce fire risks, but also they, you know, through their manure and the way they move the land around, they actually fertilize the land. In the way that this was used in the African countries where it was developed, it was principally cows being moved around, but also zebras. But because donkeys are living on this huge piece of land that Chris and his family live on, also Chris had the idea of working with donkeys as well as with cattle. So what I really like about this project is it's a way of thinking much more creatively about how can human interests and ecological interests and donkey interests actually work together instead of assuming that they're necessarily working separately. So with that, you know, the final slide, that I really love this painting by an Aboriginal artist, which I think really beautifully represents the idea that donkeys aren't these kind of other invasive beings who don't belong here, but actually do belong here. And we just have to remake how we think about our landscape use and our understanding of who is Australian at the level of animals, not just people, in order to recognise that they do have a place here. So that is it from me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions. I know you're not so much the ecologist, you're more around the way we think about this. So one of the first questions I have is, do you have any theories about why the brumby gets so much attention in Australia around the welfare of the brumby and the outcries when they're killed, yet the donkey seems to fly under the radar and people seem really unaware of what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I mean, my hypotheses are that horses, if you look at the narratives of the kind of outback Australia, horses, brumbies have been very woven into those narratives. So if you go to galleries and go and look at the kind of 19th century paintings, you'll often see horses as part of the landscape. There's a kind of legendary notion about, you know, wild horses and brumbies, and they're in Australian poems. They're in the poems of Banjo Paterson. So they're kind of written into this identity of the kind of outback masculinist, notion of the Australian. Whereas donkeys just are, people, I mean, I'm sure you've come across this. Most people don't even know that there are wild donkeys in Australia. They've kind of been wiped from the history of Australia. So I think that's one dimension of it. And the other is that there is a real hierarchy between donkeys and horses. Donkeys have this, of course, completely incorrectly, but I think there's a class dimension. So horses are seen as somehow, a higher class of beings than donkeys. And there's all sorts of nobility associated with horses that is just not built into the, of course, completely anthropocentric narratives. These have nothing to do with donkeys or horses themselves. But I think it's all about the types of stories that we tell ourselves about, Australian history that just have donkeys written out of them.
And do you think that there's value in renaming them? I mean, I know that I like the name Teamster, and I push quite a bit to have them known as Teamsters. Do you think referring to them as a Teamster rather than a feral donkey is there any value in that, or do you think it's not really that important?
Absolutely. I think language is incredibly important. I mean, in the United States, as you know, donkeys are known as burros, right? So it's just this kind of friendly, Hispanic term. It gives them a sense of belonging. As soon as you call an animal feral or invasive, or a plant for that matter, I mean, you call, land care groups are always out there, poisoning with, Roundup, which is worse for the environment than any invasive plant is. You call it invasive and feral, and that's the end of the conversation. So I think, this is a multi-dimensional, as with any complex problem, we have to work on it on many levels. But I think the language, the discursive level is a really important one.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions for Danielle?
No, thank you. No, been very interesting. Yes.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to the work that you guys are doing. Ruth and I attended the Donkey Welfare Symposium this last year, which had a focus on donkey welfare. And I mean, we both heard Ariane talk and Eric talk, and it completely opened my eyes to this whole thing. Like, I had absolutely no idea. And I've had a lovely phone conversation with you, Danielle, about this, which has just been, really empowering to learn about this, and I think that's why I wanted you to talk to the group, because I think it's a really important way to examine our own thoughts about the animals around us and how we think about them. We all love donkeys, but there's a lot of other animals in Australia that are sort of falling under the same banner. So thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us.
That's my pleasure. I mean, the one thing I would add is that for those of us, and I think that's everybody here, who are trying to think strategically about how do we counter the development of an ejiao industry in Australia, you need to know your enemy. And donkeys have a lot of enemies in this country, and a lot of powerful enemies in this country. And when I started to do research on this, I actually had to, I had to redesign the research, because I had initially thought that I was going to do interviews with people from biosecurity groups, registered biosecurity groups. And after my first interview, when, I had an hour and a half of the guy talking about dropping donkeys, and all of this just horrific euphemistic language, and this enormous pride that they have in how many they kill and how many jennies they collar, I just was, I was in such a state that I realized I can't do these interviews. I just can't sit and be the good researcher and kind of neutrally listen to them talking about the mass murder of beings who I love. That really the complete erasure of these beings as, complex, sentient, profoundly relational beings that we all know they are. There's just absolutely no recognition of that. it's as if there's some sort of monsters that just need to be wiped out.
When we follow group, on Facebook groups of people in America, like one of our first people that did a Zoom seminar was a tip retrainer. She does burrow retraining, and there's a whole process where the burrows are mustered, and then they work their way through the system to these retrainers, then they're found homes. And these people sort of say to us, how do your wild donkeys get retrained here? And we're like, they appear at the sales sometimes, and if we're lucky, people buy it. It's really interesting the differing ways that I think because there's no outcry when it's happening, I guess.
Yeah.
My husband and I travelled around Australia a lot of years ago now, but because we were always interested in donkeys, and we came across in the late 80s a beautiful 14-hand donkey, who Pam is well familiar with, our Sarah, and she'd come out of the Flinders Ranges, we found, but we weren't able to trace anything back. And she was a genuine 14 hands and an absolutely beautiful girl that we did so many years of riding and driving and all sorts with her, and we wanted more. And as we travelled around Australia, we talked to people everywhere we went about donkeys. And yes, we came across the same thing you did, that they're just unwanted feral animals, except some Aboriginals that we went on a tour with, and they had them on their property and they were very fond of them. But people would just say, yes, they shoot them or whatever, they were just unwanted animals.
I think, Ruth, didn't your mum find something similar when she was trying to get hold of donkeys? It was just almost impossible when she was trying.
Yeah, she couldn't get them taken seriously as stock. She ended up getting pet people to get them, people that would normally get dogs and cats.
They've always had such a low status, and that's the thing that I don't understand. I remember when me and Chase got into light horse with the whalers, I was doing some research for a project at work on some of the diggers that went overseas, and you can find equipment for horses well documented, from bridles to saddles to harness, to every single horse that went there was registered, every single person that went there was registered, and you couldn't find anything on donkeys. They just weren't, they were persona non gratis, didn't appear on any
basically
records.
Petty cash.
Yeah.
Didn't you say they would just like buy them from petty cash? There's like, go get us some donkeys,
But they didn't keep any lists of any animals or any donkey equipment or anything. It was just bizarre.
Yeah,
it's our job
yet, in the UK, I mean, donkeys in the UK are just beloved. I mean, the donkey sanctuary is one of the highest earning charities in the UK. It's just extraordinary. There are so many organisations that protect donkeys there, but here it's a completely different matter.
They were very much part of the English countryside, I guess, and everything growing up. There wouldn't have been a kid my age that went to a beach in England that didn't go for a ride on a donkey. I think there was a fondness with the donkeys in the UK because they were used for pulling milk around or kids rides at the beach or whatever. So you just don't see that.
Yet they're no more native in the UK than they are here. That's the interesting thing. They're not from there either.
Yeah, I mean, it's about the stories that we tell ourselves.
Well, I bought into the Yellowstone model for years. This whole idea of, I was really unsure about the whole Brumby culling thing. I was like, well, the native animals, and then this whole reading about the fact that it is a totally arbitrary human-created, line in the sand. I think, what is it called? The white dude moment. I think I read somewhere that they called it.
Emma Maris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great book. there's a great book called Where Do Camels Belong? Well, they originated in North America, but then we know about them from the Middle East, but yet the most wild camels are in Australia. So where, it's just, really challenges your biases that you've just internalized without realizing.
And then climate change and extinction add a whole other layer to it, because animals, with climate changing so quickly, animals can't necessarily survive in their native ranges. And so, where they're going to be able to survive is going to be shifting for a whole new set of reasons.
Well, a guy on the radio was saying that there are songbirds that the Acclimatization Society brought to Australia in the Victorian era that are now becoming extinct in Europe, and the populations that are here that are pests are actually the only populations left in the world. So what do you do? Do you go, well,
I just did a quick Google search on donkey riding in the UK, because I was wondering if it was still a thing in terms of people going to the seaside. It's very much still a thing. But there was an interesting piece that came up, a threat to century-old seaside donkey rides because of coronavirus. So there's a bit of a welfare problem at the moment because nobody's riding donkeys. So all the donkeys are becoming unfit because they'd be out every day walking the beaches and being ridden and that sort of stuff. And yeah, it looks like the coronavirus has thrown a bit of a spanner in that works. But still there's a top 10 places to go donkey riding by the sea, that sort of stuff. And we don't have that as part of our culture, I think, in terms of donkeys. They're not beloved. They're just, as you say, they're feral somewhere else, rather than, I can imagine if you could get a donkey ride down Williamstown Beach, you get a few more people concerned about their plight. If they could think back to.
People just have to see them. I mean, I tried this year to get a donkey into Equitana, and they didn't want to upset the horses. It's getting donkeys in front of people is part of the problem.
Sorry, go on, Pam.
Perhaps the history of how donkeys came to Australia compared to how they came to UK has an impact on how much they're beloved in the UK compared to here.
Yeah, maybe.
Because most people have only ever known them to be in Central Australia as feral historically, but I don't think that was the same case in the UK. So it goes back historically.
We don't have a centralised barren land in the UK, except for the Midlands.
But it's also that the hare is beloved in the UK, and that's not a native UK animal. And there's animals that they're now discovering that people think, in the whole conversation about what's native and what's not, there's animals that people think are native that actually they're now discovering aren't, which is really interesting.
Yeah, but there's a fair point though, because in the UK the donkeys are very much in major regional centres. So every beach has got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people going there every year, and seeing donkeys on the beach is nothing new or particularly exciting, because it's but when their donkeys are sitting in central Australia and they're not being seen in those regional and sort of metro areas, it's a distant problem, isn't it?
Yep, I think so. Yes, I think so.
So who's taking their donkeys down the beach tomorrow to give people free rides?
No. All right, Danielle, I know you're really busy, so I'll let you go. Thank you so much for today. I really appreciate it. And, hopefully, if you ever can think of a way that the donkey community can help, we're all standing by, ready to raise up our, banners for donkeys. So we'll follow the work that you guys are doing with interest.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.